Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently reading The Amityville Horror by J. Anson. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back and relax, and enjoy the story. This week we are starting with Chapter 17. January 6th. Your story is very interesting, Frank, but if I didn't know your background as a pro, I'd honestly think you were a little nuts to believe in it. Chancellor Ryan got up from behind his desk and went to the new coffee machine across the room. Father Mancuso shook his head at Father Ryan's offer. Ryan then poured one black cup for Father Nuncio, the other chancellor, and one for himself. The chancellor sat back down at his desk, sipped some of the coffee, then looked at his notes. In your capacity as a psychotherapist, how many times have people come to you with stories like this? Hundreds, I'll bet. Chancellor Ryan was an extremely tall man, even while sitting. He was 6'5", with a shock of white hair crowning a ruddy Irish face. The priest was well known in the diocese for his open manner in speaking to the other clerics, be they young parish priests or the bishop himself. Chancellor Nuncio, on the other hand, was the exact opposite, short, stumpy, black-haired, young at 42, while Father Ryan was well in his 60s, but with a seriousness to his approach that perfectly complemented the other chancellor's softer touch. The two had listened to Father Mancuso's recounting of the episodes that George Lutz had said happened at 112 Ocean Avenue, and to his own humiliating experiences, including the latest one that had just occurred at the rectory. They were impressed with Father Mancuso's fears that the phenomena had a demonic taint to them. Chancellor Ryan looked up from the pad on his desk and spoke to the troubled priest. Before we offer any suggestions on how you should handle this as a participant and as a priest, Frank, I think you should know the ground rules, Father Ryan added to Father Nuncio. The other priest put down his coffee. You seem to think that there's something demonic going on in the Lutzes' house, and that the place is possessed somehow. Well, let me reassure you that, first of all, places and things are never possessed, only people. Father Nuncio stopped, reached into his jacket, and withdrew several short cigars. He offered them around, but the two priests declined. He lit up, puffing and talking at the same time. The traditional viewpoint of the Church sees the devil in a number of ways. He tries through temptation, by which he is seen to prod men towards sin in the psychological battles with which I'm sure you're familiar. Oh, yes, Father Mancuso nodded. As Father Ryan mentioned, I've seen and heard many who've come to me as a psychotherapist and as a parish priest. Chancellor Ryan picked up the thread. Then there are the so-called extraordinary activities of the devil in the world. Usually these are material things around a person that are affected, that might be what you're up against. We call it infestation. It breaks down into different categories, which we'll explain in a few minutes. Obsession, Father Nuncio put in, is the next step, in which the person is affected either internally or externally. And finally there is possession, by which the person temporarily loses control of his faculties, and the devil acts in and through him. When Father Mancuso had come to the Chancellor's office to keep his appointment, he had been somewhat embarrassed as to how to approach his problem, but he relaxed as the two priests had shown keen interest. Now, with their spelling out the guidelines, he must take in this kind of situation. Father Mancuso raised his hopes for deliverance from this evil. In investigating cases of possible diabolical interference, Chancellor Ryan went on, we must consider the following. 1. Fraud and deception. 2. Natural scientific causes. 3. Parapsychological causes. 4. Diabolical influences. And 5. miracles. In this case, fraud and trickery don't seem plausible. George and Kathleen Lutz seem to be normal, balanced individuals. We think you are, too. The possibilities, therefore, are reduced to psychological, parapsychological, or diabolical influences. We'll exclude the miraculous, Father Nuncio broke in, because the divine would not involve itself in the trivial and foolish. True, said Father Ryan. Therefore, the explanation would seem to include hallucination and autosuggestion, like the invisible touches Kathy experienced, and when George thought he heard that marching band. But let's take the parapsychological line. Parapsychologists, like Dr. Ryan, who works at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, define 4 main operations in the science. The first 3 come under the general heading of ESP, extrasensory perception. They are mental telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition, which could explain George's visions and picking up information that seems to coincide with known facts about the DeFeos. The 4th parapsychological area is psychokinesis, where objects move by themselves. That would be the case with the Lutz's ceramic lion, if it did indeed move, he added. Father Nuncio got up to refill his cup. All of what we've said, Frank, is part of the suggestion we have for the Lutzes. Have them contact some investigative organization like Dr. Rhines to come in and look at the house. They'll do extensive testing, and I'm sure they can come to some conclusion short of diabolical influence. But what about me? Asked Father Mancuso. What do I do? Chancellor Ryan cleared his throat and looked kindly at the priest. You are not to return to that house. You can call the Lutzes and tell them what we suggested, but under no circumstances are you ever to go there again. I thought you said I was foolish for believing in such things, Father Mancuso protested. Yes, I did, said Father Ryan, but you've got yourself so worked up over this affair that at the moment the best thing you can do is disassociate yourself from the Lutzes and 112 Ocean Avenue. After breakfast, Kathy dropped the boys off at their new school, then drove over to her mother's with Missy. George was alone in the house. He had gone down to the cellar to clear the odor with 2 fans, but when he came down the stairs, there was no trace of any of the terrible stench that had made him vomit the day before. He sniffed but could find nothing, even when he went directly to the secret red room. George pulled the plywood paneling back open and flashed his light about the red walls. Damn, he said. It couldn't have disappeared just like that. There's got to be an air hole down here somewhere. George was searching for that possible air vent when Father Mancuso dialed his number. After the meeting, the priest had driven back to his own quarters in North Merrick, intending to call George with the Chancellor's recommendations. He heard the telephone ring 10 times before he finally hung up. Father Mancuso thought he'd try again later when the Lutzes came home. George was home all right, but he never heard the telephone ring. The door to the basement was open, and usually the ringing telephone could be heard anywhere in the house. George had no success in finding any opening where the stench could have escaped, but under the area where the front steps to the house had been constructed, he did discover something interesting. When the contractor had laid the foundation for the house at 112 Ocean Avenue, it seemed he had covered over a circular opening with a concrete lid. By scrolling around the dirt piled up against the protuberance, George accidentally loosened some of the old gravel around the base and heard it fall into water far below. He flashed his light and saw the beam hit against a wet, black shaft. A well, he said aloud. That doesn't show up in the blueprints. It must have been left from the old house that was here before. He returned to the first floor and looked at the kitchen clock. Strange, he thought. It's almost noon, and I still haven't heard from Father. I'd better try him myself. George called the rectory. The priest picked up on the first ring. George was surprised when Father Mancuso told him he had just called and that there was no answer at the house. Then George asked Father Mancuso when he was coming, and they got down to Father Mancuso's report. He said he'd been to see the chancellors of his diocese and repeated their recommendation that George find an organization to conduct a scientific investigation of the house. Father Mancuso gave George the address of a psychic research institute in North Carolina and suggested he get in touch with them immediately. George agreed, but pressed the priest to come to the house. Not until many months after he and his family had fled 112 Ocean Avenue would George Lutz learn what Father Mancuso had suffered after he originally blessed their house, or of his subsequent humiliations and afflictions. Therefore, when Father Mancuso again refused to come to the house, George became confused. He said he really needed him, not some ghost-chasing outfit from somewhere down south, and who, he wanted to know, was supposed to pay for all of this. But after promising to call the parapsychologists and to let Father Mancuso know the results of the investigation, George hung up. He was still annoyed when he called Kathy at her mother's. George told her what the priest had said, but snorted that he wasn't going to bother with anything like that. But Kathy felt they should pursue the chancellor's recommendations, telling George that he should listen to what the church suggested. Finally, George agreed, saying he would drive to his office on his Harley chopper and type out the letter to the people at Duke. He didn't tell her he also wanted to talk to Eric, the young fellow at his office, who said his girlfriend was a medium. After talking to George, Father Mancuso felt a tremendous pressure lift from his shoulders. Just the fact that he had been able to share his burden with others cleared his head completely for the first time in weeks. The responsibility he had been bearing alone had been taken away by his superiors. The priest turned to preparing his work schedule for the following week. It took him several hours, until dinner time, to finally nail down the program he wanted for his counseling and for his patients. He ordered Chinese food from a nearby restaurant in North Merrick and wolfed down the meal while reading his case histories. George rode to his office and mailed the letter to the parapsychologists, using the chancellor's names as his reference. He didn't really expect an immediate response to his request for an investigator, so he only put a regular stamp on the envelope instead of an airmail one. Then he telephoned Eric's girlfriend, Francine. She was terribly interested in what he had to say, sure that she could contact whatever or whoever was making his and Kathy's lives miserable. She promised to come to the Lutzes' house with her boyfriend in a day or so. Then the young woman said something that really made George's ears perk up. Out of the clear blue, she mentioned that George should look around his property for an old, abandoned, covered-up well. He didn't admit that he had already found such a place, but asked instead why she wanted him to do the searching. Her answer shocked him. "I think," she said, "that your spirits may be coming from a well. You can cap it off, you know, but I bet if you do find a well under your house, there is a direct passage to it, and somehow, even if it's a tiny crack, that's all it takes. With that, it can climb out when it wants to." After thanking the girl and hanging up, George made a phone call to the Psychic Research Institute in Durham, North Carolina, and told them of the letter he had just sent. They agreed to send a field investigator as soon as possible. In turn, George agreed to pay the field man's expenses. Father Mancuso, too, was on the telephone once more that night. The call came after 11 and was, surprisingly, from the priest who had helped him when his car fell apart on the Van Wyck Expressway. Both clerics recalled the harrowing events of that evening, and Father Mancuso asked the other priest whether he had encountered any further trouble after his windshield wipers had gone berserk. "No," his friend said. "That is, not until a few minutes ago." Father Mancuso's heart began to beat loudly against his chest. "Frank," the other priest continued, "I just got a peculiar phone call. I don't know who it was, but he said, 'Tell the priest not to come back.'" "Who was he talking about?" Father Mancuso asked. "I asked that. I said, 'Who are you talking about?' The voice only answered, 'The priest you helped.'" "The priest you helped?" "Yeah. I thought about that after he hung up, and I couldn't remember anybody but you. Do you think he really means you, Frank?" "He never told you who it was?" "No. He just said, 'The priest'll know who it is.'" What did he actually say?" "He said, 'Tell the priest not to come back, or he'll die.'" Chapter 18. January 6th to the 7th. Earlier that day, Kathy had returned from her mother's house in time to pick up Danny and Chris at their new school in Amityville. The boys were eager to tell about their teachers, schoolmates, and playground facilities. The yard had been cleared of snow, and the children had been able to enjoy some activities outside. Missy, jealous at having to stay home, kept pumping her brothers about what the girls at the elementary school were like. The whole family ate together at 6:30. George told Kathy what he had done about Father Mancuso's suggestion, and that he had also spoken to the girl who could contact spirits. Kathy was glad that he had called the parapsychology people instead of just waiting for an answer to his letter, but she wasn't too happy about a stranger coming into her house to talk to ghosts, particularly a young girl like Francine. After they had finished dinner, Kathy told George she really wanted to return to her mother's until she felt the house was safe to live in. George reminded her that it was 10 degrees above zero outside, and snow was forecast by morning. Even though East Babylon wasn't too far up the road, he didn't think she could make it from her mother's house back to Amityville in time to get the boys to school in the morning. Danny and Chris chimed in that they wanted to stay home. They had some homework to do, and besides, their grandmother wouldn't let them watch television after 8 o'clock. Kathy finally gave in to their arguments, but felt uneasy about staying in the house another night. She told George she didn't think she could sleep a wink. Harry had been in the kitchen with them while they were eating, and Kathy had given the dog all the scraps of meat left over from dinner. Before they went to bed, George thought that Harry might be better off staying inside that night. It was bitter cold out and would only get worse if the snow fell. Harry hadn't been served his usual dry food, and George thought the dog might be more alert after having some red meat. While the boys did their homework, Missy took Harry up to her room to play. But Harry didn't want to stay there. He was nervous and sniveling, Kathy noted, particularly after Missy had introduced Harry to her unseen friend, Jody. Finally, the little girl had to close her door to keep Harry from running out. He crawled under her bed and remained there. Finally, Chris came down for him. Harry scampered out of Missy's room and, with his tail between his legs, ran up the stairs to the 3rd floor, where he remained the rest of the night. At 12, when George and Kathy finally went up to bed, she went out like a light for the 3rd night in a row, quickly falling into a deep sleep, her breathing heavy. But George, lying on his side with his back to Kathy, was wide awake, his ears alert for any signs of the marching band. When he first noticed the snowflakes falling outside the windows, he saw it was 1 o'clock on his wristwatch. The wind was rising, whipping the flakes about. Then he thought he heard a boat moving on the Amityville River. but the bedroom windows didn't face the water, and George didn't feel like getting up from his warm bed to look out from Missy's or the sewing room windows. Besides, the river was frozen, so George ascribed the sound to the vagaries of the wind. At 2 a.m. he began to yawn. His eyes were getting heavy, and his body was getting stiff from lying in one position. A short while ago he had looked over his shoulder at Kathy. She was still flat on her back, her mouth open. Suddenly George had the urge to get up and go to the Witch's Brew for a beer. He knew there were cans of beer in the refrigerator, but he kept thinking that they wouldn't slake his thirst. It had to be the Witch's Brew, and it didn't matter that it was 2 a.m. or that it was freezing out. He turned to wake Kathy and tell her he was going out for a while. But in the darkness of the room, George could see that Kathy wasn't in bed. He could see that she was levitating again, almost a foot above him, drifting away from him. Instinctively, George reached out, grabbed her hair, and yanked. Kathy floated back to him and then fell back into the bed. She awoke. George turned on the nightstand light next to him and gasped. He was looking at a 90-year-old woman, the hair wild, a shocking white, the face a mass of wrinkles and ugly lines, and saliva dripping from the toothless mouth. George was so revolted he wanted to flee from the room. Kathy's eyes, set deep in the wrinkles, were looking at him questioningly. George shuddered. "It's Kathy," he thought. "This is my wife. What the hell is going on here?" Kathy sensed the fright in her husband's face. My God, what does he see? She leaped from the bed and ran into the bathroom, flicking on the light above the mirror. Staring at her own face, she screamed. The ancient crone George had seen was gone. The hair was upset, but it was blonde again. Her lips were not drooling any longer, nor was she wrinkled, but deep, ugly lines ran up and down her cheeks. George, following Kathy into the bathroom, peered over her shoulder at the image. He, too, saw that the 90-year-old visage had faded, but the long black slashes still cut deeply down Kathy's face. "What's happening to my face?" Kathy yelled. She turned to George, and he put his fingers up to Kathy's mouth. Her lips were dry and burning hot. Then he ran his fingertips gently across the deep ridges. There were 3 on each cheek, extending from just below her eyes down to just under the jawline. "I don't know, baby," he whispered. George took a towel from the rack next to the sink and tried to wipe the lines away. Kathy spun about and looked into the mirror. Her scarred face stared back at her. Running her own fingers down her face, she began to cry. Kathy's helplessness stirred George deeply, and he put his hands on her shoulders. "I'm going to call Father Mancuso right now," he said. Kathy shook her head. "No, we mustn't involve him in this." She looked at George's face reflected in the mirror. "Something tells me he could get hurt. We better go and check on the kids," she said calmly. The children were all right, but George and Kathy were unable to go back to sleep that night. They stayed in their bedroom, with the lights out, watching the snow fall. Every once in a while, Kathy would hold her hands to her face, checking to feel if the ridges were still there. Finally, the cold dawn broke. The snow had stopped, and there was just enough light for George to make out Kathy when she touched him on the shoulder. "George," she said, "look at my face." He turned from his position he had taken in a chair near the window and looked at his wife. In the dawn's weak light, George could see that the lines were gone. He put his fingers up to her face and touched her skin. It was soft again, with absolutely no trace of the disfiguring scars. "They're gone, baby," he smiled gently. "They're all gone." In spite of what Kathy had said during the night, George called Father Mancuso in the morning and caught the priest just before he went to early Mass. George told him that he had spoken to North Carolina, where a Jerry Solfen had promised to have an investigator come to the house immediately. Then he brought up the incident of the night before. Father Mancuso was aghast about the second levitation and the alterations of Kathy's face. "George," he said urgently, "I'm worried about what could happen next. Why don't you just get out of that house for a while?" George assured the priest he had been thinking of doing just that, but first he wanted to see what Francine, the medium, had to say. Maybe she could help, as she had claimed. "A medium?" Father Mancuso asked. "What are you talking about, George? That's not a scientific investigation." "But she said she can talk to spirits," George protested. "In fact, Father, do you know what she said yesterday? She told me there's a well hidden under my house. Well, she's right. I found one under the stoop, and she's never even been here before." Father Mancuso became angry. "Listen," he shouted over the phone. "You're involved in something dangerous. I don't know what is going on in your house, but you'd better get out." "You mean just leave everything?" "Yes, just go for a while," the priest persisted. "I'll talk to the chancellors again and see if they can send someone, maybe a priest." George was silent. He had been trying to get Father Mancuso to his house and been refused time and again. The priest's superiors had done nothing but suggest he contact some organization. Finally, he had someone who sounded as if she could actually help him and Kathy. Why should he just leave everything and walk out? "I'll tell Kathy, Father," George finally said. "Thanks." He was about to hang up. "George, there's just one more thing," said Father Mancuso. "I seem to recall that you and Kathy were into transcendental meditation at one time." "Yes, that's right." "Do you still practice that?" the priest asked. "No, well, yes. Well, we haven't really kept it up since we've moved here," George answered. "Why?" "I was just curious, George, that's all," Father Mancuso replied. "I'm glad you're not doing it now. It might have been making you susceptible." Right after talking with George, Father Mancuso called the Chancery in Rockville Center. Unfortunately, Chancellors Ryan and Nuncio were unavailable, and their secretary could only promise to have them call the following day. The priest was extremely agitated and prayed that things would not continue to deteriorate until the church could bring its forces to bear against the evil that gripped 112 Ocean Avenue. In his compassion for the Lutzes' plight, Father Mancuso forgot about his own dilemma, but in a few minutes he was violently reminded that he, too, was subject to the unrelenting influence. He began to shiver and shake. His stomach heaved and his throat tightened. The priest sneezed and his eyes watered. He sneezed again and saw blood on the tissue. Chancellor Ryan's warning, "Don't involve yourself any more," flashed across his mind. But it was too late. Father Mancuso had all the signs of another attack of the flu. Later that evening, Eric, the young engineer who worked at George's company, arrived at the Lutz's home with his girlfriend Francine. George immediately hustled the young couple out of the bitter cold and into the living room to warm themselves in front of the big fire. They brought an infectious cheerfulness that had been missing at 112 Ocean Avenue. George and Kathy responded, and soon the four were chatting away like old friends. But under George's exterior warmth, there was an urgency. He wanted Francine to look over the house. As he was trying to turn the conversation around to her experience with spirits, Francine beat him to it. Suddenly, she got up from her seat on the couch and motioned to George. "Put your hand gently over here," she said. George bent over and waved his hand where she had pointed. "Do you feel the cold air?" Francine asked. "Slightly," George answered. "She's been sitting here. Now she's left. Now follow the couch. Feel it over here?" George put his hand near a pillow. "Oh, yeah, it feels warm." Francine beckoned George and Kathy to follow her. The three entered the dining room, while Eric remained in the living room by the fireplace. Francine stood next to the big table. "There's an unusual odor here," she said. "I can't quite place it, but it's here. Phew! Do you smell that?" George sniffed. "Yeah, right here. It's a smell of perspiration." The girl headed for the kitchen, but hesitated before going into the breakfast nook. "There's an old man and an old lady. They are lost spirits. Do you smell the perfume?" Kathy's eyes widened. Quickly she looked at George, who shrugged. "Evidently these people must have had the house at one time," Francine continued. "But they died. Only I don't think they died in the house." She turned to George and said, "I want to go to the basement now, okay?" When George had first spoken to Francine on the telephone, he told her that mysterious things were happening in his house, but without ever really spelling out what the phenomena were, nor what had actually taken place with Kathy and himself. He hadn't discussed the touchings in the kitchen, nor the smell of perfume Kathy had experienced. In any case, Francine had said she would rather draw her own conclusions after visiting the house and talking to the spirits who lived there. Now Francine descended the stairs to the cellar. "The house is built on a burial ground or something like that," she said. She pointed to a large area of the basement where the storage closets were built. "Is that new?" she asked George. "I don't think so," he answered. "As far as I know, it was all built at the same time." Francine stopped in front of the closets. "There are people buried right here. Something is over them. There is an unusual odor. This should not be stuffy at all like this." She was pointing directly at the plywood paneling that hid the secret room. "Notice the chill?" Her hands were moving now, touching the wood. "Somebody was murdered, or he could even be buried under here. But this seems like a new part has been added on and over this grave." Kathy wanted to run from the basement. Her husband noticed her discomfort and reached for her hand. Francine solved their dilemma. "I don't like this spot at all. It's better that we go upstairs now." Without waiting for a response, she turned and headed for the basement staircase. As they went up to the second floor, Francine's boyfriend Eric joined them. She stood in the hallway, holding on to the banister. "I have to say that when I came up here, there was a whirling sensation. I felt a tightness on the right half of my chest." "A pain?" Kathy asked. Francine nodded. "Very slight, very quick. Right as you turned the corner, it disappeared quickly." She stepped to the closed door of the sewing room. "You've been having problems in here." George and Kathy both nodded. She opened the door, half expecting to find the flies in the room, but there were none, and he and Francine walked inside. Kathy and Eric hung back in the doorway. Suddenly, Francine appeared to go into a trance. Out of her mouth came a different voice, heavier, more masculine. "I would like to make one suggestion to you. Most people find out who their spirits are, and they find they like them. They don't want them to get lost or to go away. But in this case, I feel this house should be cleared or exorcised." The voice coming from Francine began to sound familiar to George. He couldn't quite place it, but he was sure he had heard it before. Somebody's little girl and boys. I see bloodstains. Somebody hurt themselves badly here. Someone tried to kill themselves or something. Francine came out of her trance. I would like to go now, she announced George and Kathy. It's not a good time to try to talk to the spirits. I have a feeling I should go. I was born with a Venetian veil, you know. George didn't know what she meant, but she promised George to return in a day or two. When the vibrations are better, she explained. The couple departed almost immediately. Back in the living room, George and Kathy were silent for a long time. Finally, Kathy asked, "What do you think?" "I don't know," George answered. "I just don't know. She was hitting things right on the head." He stood up to put out the fire. "I have to think about it for a while." Kathy went upstairs to check on the children. Again, Harry was staying with the boys, since it was too cold out for even a rugged dog. George made his usual check of all doors and locks, then turned out the lights on the first floor. He went up the steps to his bedroom, then stopped before he reached the second-floor landing. George saw that the banister above him was wrenched from its moorings, torn almost completely off the floor foundation. At that very instant, he recalled whose voice had been speaking to him through Francine. It was Father Mancuso. Chapter 19. January 8th. On Thursday, Jimmy and his new bride, Carrie, returned from their honeymoon in Bermuda. They called Kathy from Mrs. Connor's, and Jimmy told his sister he would drop over later in the day. One of his first questions was whether she and George had found his $1,500. He was very disappointed when Kathy told him there had been no trace of the envelope. It had taken George all morning to fit the second-floor banister's broken anchor posts back in their sockets. When the boys came down for breakfast, both wanted to help, but George shooed them out of the way, telling them they had to go shopping for new shoes with their mother. No one, Danny, Chris, Missy, or Kathy, had heard the banister being wrenched off its posts during the night. What had caused this latest damage in the house remained a mystery. George and Kathy had their own ideas, but did not voice them in front of the children. Finally, Kathy gathered herself together and herded her brood out to the van to go shopping. George took the opportunity to call Eric. He reached him at home and asked the young man if Francine had said anything after leaving their home. George was troubled to hear that the girl had been very upset with what she felt in the house. She had told Eric she didn't ever want to go back there. The presence was much too strong. She feared if she tried to talk to whoever was at the Lutzes, she would be in danger of a physical attack. "Eric," George asked, "what's the Venetian veil she mentioned just before you left?" "From what Francine's told me," Eric answered, "there's a caul some babies are born with, a kind of skin covering, like a thin veil over the face. It can be removed, but Francine says that that person is somehow blessed with a highly developed degree of clairvoyance." George hung up and sat in the kitchen for over an hour, trying to think of where or how he could get help before it was too late. Then the telephone rang. It was George Kokoris, a field investigator for the Psychic Research Institute in North Carolina, who said he had been told to contact George and arrange to set up some scientific tests at the Lutz's home. Kokoris also said he couldn't make it that day, since he was calling from Buffalo, but would try to get there the next morning. After speaking to Kokoris, George felt as if he had received a last-minute reprieve. Then, to pass the time until Kathy returned, he busied himself by taking down the Christmas decorations from the tree standing in the living room. Tenderly, he placed the delicate ornaments on spread newspapers for Kathy to repack in cardboard boxes, taking special care of his great-grandmother's beautiful gold and silver piece. All that Thursday morning and afternoon, Father Mancuso nursed his recurrent case of flu. He had resigned himself to this newest affliction as another show of power and displeasure by the evil force he had alienated at 112 Ocean Avenue. This time there had been no solicitous call by the pastor, even though Father Mancuso was sure the cleric had been informed of his new illness. He remained in his own apartment, resting in bed, using the medication he had been given on the doctor's previous visits. His fever ranged as high as 104 degrees. His stomach hurt continuously, and as the day wore on, he alternated between chills and sweating. Fortunately, no marks had erupted on his palms, a sign that Father Mancuso interpreted to mean that he was receiving a lesser degree of punishment for involving himself again with the Lutzes. Father Mancuso hadn't even attempted to reach the Chancellor's office again. The priest felt that the aches and pains would eventually lessen if he divorced himself from thinking about the Lutz situation, and so he waited for Father Ryan or Father Nuncio to get in touch with him. At one point during the afternoon, in fact, the priest hoped that the chancellors would ignore his request for another audience. He passed the time by reading from his breviary. By 4 o'clock, Kathy had returned from shopping. Since the Lutzes still had Jimmy's car, there was no way for the honeymooners to travel unless they were picked up. Kathy volunteered to go after her brother and his new wife. George vetoed her suggestion. The icy roads to her mother's in East Babylon were still in the hazardous condition, and Jimmy's car had a stick shift, a gear system Kathy had never really mastered. George drove instead and was back in Amityville within the hour. Kathy was delighted to see Jimmy and Carrie again, and spent the next hours eagerly listening to their account of every single moment they had spent in Bermuda. The newlyweds also had a bundle of Polaroid snapshots to go through with a detailed explanation behind each one. Jimmy didn't have a dime left, he said, but they had memories that would last a lifetime. Naturally, they had brought some presents for the children, and that kept Danny, Chris, and Missy out of the adults' way for most of the evening. Rather than spoil the pleasant visit by recalling their own weird experiences since the wedding, George and Kathy simply shared the excitement of the other two. Eventually, Kathy and her new sister-in-law went upstairs to change the linen on Missy's bed. Jimmy and Carrie would be staying overnight in Missy's room, while the little girl slept on an old couch in the dressing room down the hall. Jimmy explained to George his plans for moving out of his mother's house. He wanted to rent an apartment situated exactly between his mother's house and his new in-laws, who also lived in East Babylon. This way, both families would be placated for a while. Everyone retired fairly early. Before turning in, George and Jimmy checked the house inside and out. George showed Jimmy the damaged garage door, but didn't offer any explanation beyond the theory that it was caused by a freak windstorm. Jimmy, who had been victimized of his money by an unknown source, was suspicious of something else, but he too kept silent and followed George as he checked the boathouse. Back inside, they continued their tour of doors and windows until both were satisfied with the security of 112 Ocean Avenue. It was 11 o'clock when the couple said goodnight to one another. George knows that it happened at 3:15 a.m. because he had been lying awake a few minutes and had just checked his wristwatch. It was then that Carrie woke up screaming. "Oh, God, not her, too," he muttered to himself. George leaped out of bed, ran to Missy's room, and snapped on the light. The young couple were huddled together in bed, Jimmy cradling his sobbing wife. "What's the matter?" George asked. "What happened?" Carrie pointed to the foot of Missy's bed. Something was sitting there. It touched my foot. George approached the spot Carrie had indicated and felt the bed with his hand. It was warm, as though someone had been sitting there. I woke up, Carrie continued, and I could see a little boy. He looked so sick. He was trying to tell me to help him. She began to cry hysterically. Jimmy shook his wife gently. Come on, Carrie, he said soothingly. You were probably just having a dream. And no, Jimmy, Carrie protested. It wasn't a dream. I saw him. He spoke to me. What did he say, Carrie? George asked. Carrie's shoulders were still shaking, but gradually she looked up from her husband's cradling arms. George heard a noise behind him and a touch on his shoulder. He jumped, then looked around. It was Kathy. Her eyes were misty, as though she too had been crying. Kathy, Carrie cried. What did the little boy say? Kathy prompted her. He asked me where Missy and Jody were. At the mention of Missy's name, Kathy bolted from the bedroom and ran to the other side of the hallway. In the dressing room, the little girl was fast asleep, with one foot sticking out in the air. Kathy lifted Missy's blanket and bent her leg back under the covers, then leaned down and kissed her child on the head. George came into the room. Is Missy all right? Kathy nodded. In about 15 minutes, Carrie had quieted down enough to fall asleep again. Jimmy was still nervous, but soon he too drifted off. George and Kathy had shut the door on the couple and returned to their own bedroom. Immediately, she went into the closet and took out the crucifix that hung inside. George, she said, let's bless this house ourselves. They began on the 3rd floor in the children's playroom. In the eerie pre-dawn silence of the cold room, George held the crucifix in front of him while Kathy intoned the Lord's Prayer. They did not go into Danny and Chris's room. Kathy said they could wait until the next day to bless that room and the ones in which Missy and Jimmy and Carrie were sleeping. They moved on to their own bedroom and then to the sewing room on the 2nd floor. Warning his wife to be careful of the newly repaired banister, George led the way down to the 1st floor, still brandishing the silver crucifix as he supposed a priest would during a holy procession. When they completed their blessing of the kitchen and the dining room, it was just starting to get light outside. Even without turning on the lights, they could see the living room dimly visible before them. George marched around the furniture, and Kathy started to recite, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy... She was interrupted by a loud humming. Kathy stopped and looked about her. George halted in mid-stride and looked up at the ceiling. The hum swelled into a jumble of voices that seemed to engulf them completely. Finally, Kathy clasped her hands to her ears to drown out the cacophony of noise, but George clearly heard the chorus thunder, Will you stop? Well, thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I tell you what, I would be out of that place faster than you could blink an eye. Next week we will start with chapter 20, and we're about 2/3, maybe 3/4 through this book. So I look forward to next week's episode, and I hope you all do too. Have a great week, everyone.